From Columbia Journalism School, this is Juan Manuel Benitez Wants to Know. Today I'm doing something a little different. Back in January, I participated in a breakfast interview with New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani, hosted by the New York Editorial Board, a group that I'm a member of. Back then, Mamdani was a progressive lone shot, a state assembly member with ambitious ideas but long odds. A lot has changed since then. Mamdani won the Democratic primary for mayor and has become some sort of a national political superstar. As we head toward the November general election, he is leading in the polls with a healthy margin. For this episode, I've stripped away all the questions and edited Mamdani's responses so they can flow as a standalone narrative. Before that, if you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe and also share it with friends who might care about the future of New York City. So settle in for this episode. Here is Zohran Mamdani.
A mayor is a messenger, a delegate, a liaison. And in my terms in the assembly, I believe that I have lived up to those requirements, most especially through launching campaigns often from scratch, most notably the Fix the MTA campaign, where we won more than $100 million in increased subway service, bus service, a reduction in the fare hike, as well as New York City's first ever free bus pilot. And in doing those things, we delivered tangible benefits to working class New Yorkers, namely putting tens of millions of dollars back in their pockets and seeing immense increases in ridership, up to 30% across those 5 bus routes, 1 in each borough, as well as a significant decrease in assaults on bus operators, 38.9% across those routes. An illustration of the fact that in a time of the climate crisis, we have a lot of options in front of us that can actually reduce a lot of the carbon emissions across our city. And one of them is when you make buses free, we saw that 11% of new riders got out of their cars or taxis they were taking and got onto public transit. So I do believe that through my work in the assembly, especially showcased with Fix the MTA, I've shown myself adept at the skills required. And I think of Michelle Wu in Boston in many ways as a model for the kind of work you do as a legislator, then becoming a mayor, and also speaking to the possibility of being a mayor at around the same age as hers. There is absolutely a necessity of competency and of being a competent manager specifically. I also think that you need to understand where your knowledge goes up until and who you need to help you to go beyond that. I have seen in previous mayoral administrations across the ideological spectrum examples that I would love to bring into my administration of how you can empower the people who know the most about the work that you're seeking to accomplish. I think that it is especially critical in a time when we have a mayor who views himself as more of a monarch, as someone who must answer every question, who must decide every agency directive, who must be in the room deciding whether or not an elected official can even meet with that agency, that we have someone who will empower the New Yorkers who are the best and brightest of our city, and that we give them the authority to actually follow through on that mandate. Furthermore, I do not believe that every single head of an agency needs to align with me 100% across every single issue, but rather specifically on that issue of that agency. And if I'm thinking about, for example, I'm a big critic of Michael Bloomberg's mayorality. I also look with deep admiration at his empowering of Jeanette Sadiq Khan to be the head of the Department of Transportation and how that reshaped the streetscape across New York City. And I think that those are the kinds of examples. Those are also the kinds of individuals that I think we have to bring into the next administration, as opposed to the people that you want to give patronage to at every single turn. Standing up universal pre-K and the beginnings of 3K is an incredible accomplishment, because alongside my very clear and explicit platform of freezing the rent, making buses fast and free, and providing universal childcare, whether your child is 6 weeks or 5 years, is a belief that government can and must do big things, that it must show itself able to intervene in the lives of working class people and provide them with relief at the very least. And I think that those accomplishments of the de Blasio administration with universal pre-K, also with multiple rent freezes, did provide that to millions of New Yorkers. And we're talking about an expense when it comes to childcare that can be $20,000 to $25,000. Now, I think in the broader analysis of income inequality across New York City, I think that some of this also has to do with being mayor at the time of a governor who was hell bent on a very different kind of politics. A governor who chases press releases and publicity more than the actual results of those programs, and one who for many years refused to even acknowledge that the state ran the MTA. And I think that some of those structural factors do create limitations. And I also think that there were some approaches in the de Blasio administration that I did disagree with. I say that as someone who was on a 15-day hunger strike protesting the de Blasio administration's approach to debt forgiveness for thousands of working class taxi drivers. And I'm proud that after that 2.5 week strike, which had already followed civil disobedience of myself and 5 other elected officials being arrested outside of City Hall, which had already followed 45 days of consecutive protest, which had already followed years of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance fighting for this issue, the de Blasio administration did change its course, and we secured more than $450 million in debt relief. So I think that obviously there are things that could have been done differently. I also think that there are a lot of things to acknowledge and appreciate, especially in light of the administration we've had since. I think there are absolutely horrific and heinous things about Donald Trump and Donald Trump's platform that we need to fight at every point. And I also think what we need to do is, many in the ways of Bernie Sanders, challenge this party to deliver on some of the things that they are lying about directly to working class voters. I am a candidate who has the only plan in this race to reduce the price of groceries. And I think one example of this is putting forward and saying, if you care so deeply about cheaper groceries, if you care so deeply about providing relief to working class people, why will you not support the only plan here that we can actually guarantee lower prices, and do so by removing profit out of the equation, do so by actually passing on the savings of rent and property tax directly to customers, and do so through a pilot program of one store in each borough that builds on the feasibility study that was done in Chicago and builds on the successes we've seen in Republican states. I think it's time also for Democrats to challenge Republicans on what they say that they believe, because what we've allowed them to do is set the message and then try and point to statistics as to how it's actually insincere instead of challenging them. If you only want to organize with individuals who are like-minded on every single issue, you are not going to win, because we do not have a legislature that reflects any kind of ideological dominance of even a progressive bend. What you need to do, in fact, is ask every single person, even those that have previously disagreed with you, to see if there's any world in which they would support this. Now, I stood side by side with people that I had endorsed primary challenges against in prior years. And I went to those individuals and asked them, don't think about me, think about what this bus could mean in your district. And I made it clear that what I was asking for in this moment was simply adherence to the vision of this proposal, not anything beyond that. In the same way that this campaign is not asking for purity across the board from everyone who supports it, that they line up with every single idea and they agree with me on every single thing, but rather that they are aligned on one central message, that New York City should be more affordable. The first thing you do is that you actually try. There are many years where Eric Adams has been the mayor where his attempts at winning over the legislature have started so late that we are starting to wonder whether they even started at all. The mayor has what has been described as the second largest bully pulpit in America. Our mayor has used that bully pulpit to come to Albany on an annual basis to seek primarily rollbacks of civil rights protections for Black and brown New Yorkers. That's what our mayor has focused his energy on, and by and large, he has been successful. And yet, as we have seen, no matter the year, no matter the extent of that rollback, New Yorkers do not actually feel a tangible benefit from it. So what I would say to you is that I would use the power of that pulpit to every single day make the case as to why our agenda needs to be enacted in Albany. When I think about de Blasio and Cuomo, that was a very difficult relationship. And when de Blasio won on a mandate similarly of 3 things, end, stop, and frisk, tax the rich to fund universal pre-K, he needed Albany for 2 and 3. And when he got there, he found a governor that was not interested at all in taxing the rich. And through his partnership and the leadership of the legislature, he was able to put Cuomo in a position where Cuomo found hundreds of millions of dollars in the general fund to make this problem go away. And that goes back to the fact that I'm not trying to win as one man crossing the finish line. I'm trying to win as someone with a mandate specifically about these 3 issues. Adams, especially through the OMB, has sought to create an artificial sense of precarity around city finances. And as the mayor, you have an immense power in putting forward the context that people are going to debate how the money should be spent. And Adams artificially reduces that amount of money, therefore forcing people to fight over scraps for many months that we then find out at the end of which there's actually more money than we anticipated. And this isn't wholly unique to Adams. We see it in Albany as well, where the governor's estimates of revenue are quite regularly outpaced by the actual amounts, the year later. But Adams does take it to a new level. And what I would do is to stop playing these kinds of budget games and to make it clear to New Yorkers that they need not expend hours of labor, of time, of anxiety towards fighting for an amount of money that they've been told is the maximum they could win, when in fact there's a far larger pot. And I would also instruct the OMB to continue to be fiscally prudent, but to understand that its mission is also to be honest, to be accurate, and to ensure that agencies can actually staff up. Because what I've been hearing from countless city workers is how OMB under Jacques Jiha has been an impediment to their ability to attract the best and brightest of talent, because they will extend job offers and then OMB will then force them to retract that offer, even though it has prior approved that very offer. And if you're a person looking for a job and you're forced to wait for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, you are going to go to another job. I would spend less money on the NYPD communications department. I also believe that we need to bring down the NYPD's near $1 billion overtime. I think that we need to disband the strategic response group. I also believe that we need to cancel the proposal to build what has been dubbed Cop City. With the city budget, and I say this as someone who deeply believes in the need for government to provide relief in working class New Yorkers' lives, and often what that looks like is an expansion of what government capacity currently is. I also know that for most New Yorkers, and what they've seen, especially under Adams, is the expansion of any agency has often been arm in arm with the expansion of patronage appointments in those agencies. And I would take a very hard look throughout the entirety of the budget to understand who is actually working for the city of New York and who is being paid a favor for having worked with Eric Adams for decades, and to make sure that every single dollar is being spent appropriately. Too often, when Donald Trump takes action, it is framed as him fulfilling a mandate of finally bringing government to account, when in fact what it means is denying millions of people health care, denying millions of people, frankly, even the ability to give birth in a hospital. And I think being willing to have that fight in public, because what we've seen under Donald Trump's first presidency is there's far more respect for someone who fights back than someone who simply relents and hopes that by doing so, the cuts will be less than they were. Freezing the rent does not cost money from the city. Now, the point that I have highlighted is that there will be landlords, as there are today, who are saying that by freezing my ability to raise the rent, you are going to force me to not be able to make repairs. There are a few things that I would say to that. The first is, in a recent budget, we increased the ability, we doubled the amount of money that landlords could extract from tenants under the basis of individual apartment improvements. I voted against that because I have found that to be a program riddled with fraud, and we've seen millions of dollars where landlords have used that as an excuse to just extract more money from tenants under the guise of improvements. Second, there is a city program that allows landlords to receive subsidy if they show their books that they cannot match things up. Now, only one landlord has applied to that program, and I believe part of that is because doing so requires them to open up their books, and it's much easier to have a public debate where you are crying about the impacts on your finances without having to actually showcase what are your books and how are these numbers matching up. Because what we've seen is many a landlord of rent-stabilized buildings, not all, but many, have also tried to take advantage of that system at many different times. So often we've been told that the rent has to go up because the costs are going up. And what we've seen is that the decisions of the Rent Guidelines Board are naked political reflections of the mayors that are in office. And they are not directly connected to inflation. They are not directly connected to cost even. And when the Rent Guidelines Board in their own data last year, they found that for landlords who owned at least one unit of rent-stabilized housing, their income was double the rate of their expenses. It is a place where there is room for relief, whereas the median household income of rent-stabilized tenants is $60,000. What we should be fighting for is the vast majority of people who are living in those apartments. And if I was able to put in a rent freeze, I wouldn't be in a rent stabilized apartment. I'd actually be on the Upper East Side in a new apartment. When I moved into this apartment, I was making $47,000 a year, and I was looking, at the time I was working as a foreclosure prevention housing counselor for Chaya CDC in Richmond Hill and Jackson Heights, and I was looking for an apartment that I could afford on my own. And I found that in this apartment. I didn't know it was rent stabilized. I found it through Street Easy. And in that time since, I've become an assembly member, and I'm now able to pay for that apartment and able to also move out of that apartment. And I plan on doing so. I don't plan on living in that apartment for perpetuity. I do think, however, with means-tested programs, what we've found, take the MTA, for example. We have fair fares, something that I've supported. It provides relief, and something that I also believe does not get close to the target of eligibility that it has. Right now, maybe 40% of eligible New Yorkers are enrolled in fair fares. The MTA has said if they get to 50, they consider it a success. When we made that one bus route free in each borough, we were told that you're subsidizing this for rich people, it's universal. We found the vast majority of New Yorkers were making $28,000 or less who were new riders to this program. If you're making that amount of money, you're eligible for fair fares. Only 14% of them were enrolled in fair fares. And what that speaks to is that if you ask working class New Yorkers, many of whom have been failed by a bureaucracy, to jump through many more hoops to get relief from that bureaucracy, you will lose about half, or in this case, even more than 80% of your target population, versus if you make it universal, the benefits are not just fiscal, they're also public safety, they're also peace of mind. When I got on the BX18A, on the first day we made it free, I was sitting next to the bus driver, and he was telling me this is the first day that I can just drive from stop to stop, and that's all I'm worried about. And as he was telling me that, a nurse got on the bus, she reached for her Metro card. He said, it's free. She said, what do you mean? He said, it's free. This is free for the year. And then she just danced down the bus to her seat. Because for her and for so many New Yorkers, when's the last time they got a break? When's the last time they felt that someone was actually looking out for them, making their life more affordable? And this is someone who's doing a public service. Free buses costs around $650 to $750 million a year. Universal childcare, we've seen estimates that it can cost at least about $5 billion a year. It is very difficult to get governors in Albany to fight or agree to increase taxes on any New Yorker. It was even more difficult under Andrew Cuomo. And in my first year as an assembly member, I was part of the fight that won around $4 billion in new taxes through raising taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers and the most profitable businesses doing business across New York State. So I do believe that there's possibility here. Now, the proposal that I've put forward, I think the bulk of these programs do need to be funded by Albany. Historically, we've seen how that works. And I think that that can come primarily through a corporate tax. A lot of the times when I'm talking about these ideas, the necessity for more revenue, it's framed as if it is inconceivable, not only in New York, but in the tri-state area. However, New Jersey has a corporate tax rate a number of percentage points higher than that of New York. If we were to match that of our regional neighbors, we would be able to pay for this entire agenda. The corporate tax rate proposal that has been put forward would raise about $7 billion per year. Now, typically, when you talk about a corporate tax rate, the rejoinder will be these companies are simply going to move out of New York State. But the nature of tax law in New York State when it comes to corporations is that they need only do business in New York State to be subject to that kind of a tax, not be headquartered. Separately to that, I believe the city has a part to play in funding some of these pieces of this platform. The MTA is a state agency. Typically, when I talk about making buses free, what I will hear is, this person doesn't know, this is the MTA state agency. The city already subsidizes the MTA about $750 million for MTA buses as part of an agreement that happened under Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg, again, was so passionate about the extension of the 7 train line into Hudson Yards that he used city funding to pay more than $1 billion to construct that subway station, a responsibility that is typically under the auspices of the state. The point of this is to say that there's room for creativity, there's room for commitment. Now, how would you find that extra money in New York City? One way, I think, is collecting the money that is owed to the city. The city is owed more than $800 million in uncollected fines from landlords across New York City. We are in a city right now where the New York Times has identified the largest landlord as Columbia University, closely followed by New York University, institutions that are technically educational, but whose reach has gone far beyond that of an educational institution, and who currently are exempt on more than $320 million in property taxes. It takes an incredible amount of effort to move anything through. I would say. What would be extremely useful is if we had someone with a larger bully pulpit, say, for example, the mayor of New York, standing up and calling for these kinds of things. There's actually bipartisan support for a lot of these kinds of proposals. As someone who has been attacked by the New York Post and likely will be attacked in the future, but also someone whose legislation has been endorsed by the New York Post, namely to repeal Columbia and NYU's property tax exemptions and redirect that funding to CUNY. That is something that there is a new pathway for. And courteously, we're calling for that same kind of exemption to be ended. So I think that there's a lot of ingredients here to actually break this through. What we have right now is not only an inability to fill the positions that are budgeted for, but a desire at almost every turn to constrict the scope and the size of those agencies, unless, of course, if there's someone that Eric Adams is friends with. And you can feel this as a New Yorker. You can feel the breakdown of much of our city. And sometimes it's in ways that isn't even obvious. You know, I was at one of my favorite restaurants in Astoria. I was having biryani, and I was very excited, having looked forward to it all day. And then the cockroach came by my table. And as one does, I thought, what does Eric Adams have to do with this breakdown in this moment? And the truth is that under Adams, we've seen inspections of restaurants go down to about 66%, whereas in the final year of de Blasio, it was about 99%. There is very possibly, there's a lot of money that's currently being spent that Eric Adams has chosen to spend in his administration that is not actually fulfilling a lot of what I'm talking about. And that goes back to the commitment before to take on patronage and to ensure that we are actually searching for quality and qualifications and not connections. As the next mayor of New York City, I would be proud of investing in New York City public school students. And at the same time, I think we desperately need better outcomes. And I think that sometimes those outcomes are not always directly related to additional investment. They also have to do with prioritization. They also have to do with follow through. There's a pilot program right now in the Bronx. Doesn't have that much of a fiscal cost, but the benefits are immense. It's called Every Child and Family is Known. It's a pilot program that speaks to what to me is one of the greatest stains on our public school system, which is that 1 in 8 public school students is homeless. This program connects New York City public school students and their families who live in shelters with employees of the public school system and requires that that child meet with the public school staff member once a day in person, and that staff member meet with the family once a week in person. And that kind of a connection and prioritization has had immense outcomes for students, not only retention in those classes, but also the connection between them and school life, that of their families. We also cannot disconnect it from what's going on in students' lives outside. There are decisions that Adams has made, particularly thinking about the 30 and 60-day shelter limits, that have not only been cruel and unnecessary, but also been ones that have completely disconnected so many students from the schools that some of whom have been flourishing in. And I've spoken to public school staff, teachers, who have talked about the fact that they've had students who have been thriving in a setting and then after 3-4 months have had to leave. What do we think that does for these kinds of outcomes? And obviously, some of the critiques you're making are longstanding. They're not only as per the last few years. But I do think that some of this is indicative of, is this a priority for you? How do you actually transform these schools? And also, what we have right now is in Albany, we've taken attempts at changing what it means to be a public school student, what it means to be a public school teacher, namely through class size reduction. And what we've had is Adams trying to find every which way he can to slow roll the implementation of this. In this campaign, there are aspects of my identity that make me stand out. I am the first Muslim or even South Asian elected official to run for mayor. I would be, one of only a few immigrant mayors in New York City. But this campaign is not about my identity. I have acknowledged those things, and I have spoken about the need to foreground who the politics is actually for and what we are actually fighting for. And I think in many ways that has been the most successful parts of left interventions in electoral politics. And I often think about the way that New York City is caricatured in a political landscape sense. We often talk about Staten Island as if it is the home of Trump Republicanism, that Democrats on Staten Island are but people waiting to vote for a Republican in a general election. And yet what we found is when there was a message of economic inequality and the necessity of taking on a system that has left people behind, 42% of that voting base came out for Bernie Sanders in 2016. And I think that there's a true ability to go beyond the corridors that we've been told this is where a progressive lives and this is where a progressive dies. And there are different aspects of the same message that appeal to many, many people, as long as you don't ask them to stand up and subscribe to every single thing that you might say and every single thing you might believe, and that you're respectful when you're faced with that disagreement. I think that we need to create a new system of mental health responders and homelessness outreach that is led by a team trained exclusively for that purpose, building on the successful models that we've seen in Eugene, in Olympia, in Denver, where you task people with a responsibility that they are actually trained for. Right now, what we are doing is putting a new task on the police very regularly, one that they often are either not trained for or not interested in fulfilling. And when you ask New Yorkers, do you want to see someone on your platform? Oftentimes, the only way that question is framed is, do you want to see a police officer on the platform, or are you happy with things as they are? Things as they are is not acceptable. What we've seen in these other cities, where the approach is far more extensive, and what I also think that it would do is take what is another blight in our public transit system, which is the immense vacancies of commercial units across the system. I remember I moved to the city when I was 7 years old, and I recall taking the 1 train to the 2 train and transferring at Times Square, and I would always go by what was then a record store. They'd be selling CDs, they'd be selling headphones. You do that today, it's vacant. There were 2 authors, one of whom I actually had known and had met in a number of political meetings years ago. He spoke about how for the last 2 years, he had been hospitalized over 20 times and had been sleeping on the subway system. And this was quite jarring for me as someone who sat next to this person at meetings in 2020, 2019. And he spoke about the thing that transformed him, that allowed him to go beyond that revolving door, was a clubhouse model that he had found at Fountain House. And we need to have these kinds of models that have been shown to be effective. When you're looking at CompStat from 2023 to 2024, you see increases in felony assaults. You also see increases in rapes. And these are horrific. These are things we have to take on. I was quite taken by the article in Vital City that was talking about looking at crime and stepping back in an analysis, not only on a year-to-year basis, but also over decades. And one thing that it identified was that crimes that had a financial motive, theft, burglary, larceny, have fallen dramatically over the years. And crimes that are born more out of anger, crimes that are also far more random, have risen. So I think there are a few things. One is that right now we are tasking the NYPD with so many different responsibilities. I believe that we need to take the NYPD out of traffic enforcement, for example. We need to ensure that responses to mental health crises and to homelessness are not the responsibility of the NYPD. And I think that some of these kinds of steps can also ensure that we see greater clearance rates in these specific categories. I think that involuntary commitment should be the last resort that a city takes. And fundamentally, I'm driven by outcomes. And there was a recent study that I read that put a large question as to whether the benefits of this are as they are stated, or whether this is simply a policy that has now come back in vogue as we've seen the inability to implement so many of the alternatives over the last few years. Homelessness across our subway system, it is something that we have to tackle. It is also something that, if we're actually looking at the numbers, there are not as many New Yorkers as is often conceived that are actually living on our subway platforms. We're seeing 4,000 or so New Yorkers who are living on our subway platforms. And when we look at the inefficiency of government to respond to applications from those very New Yorkers for supportive housing, we have to do more than just that which feels good and that which actually accomplishes what it is that we're seeking to. And I want to drill down on what will actually deliver a very different subway system, a very different New York City. And I think a lot of that has to do with putting New Yorkers into housing. I think housing first is an incredibly important approach. And I also think actually having people who are tasked and trained and invested in to do this kinds of responsiveness. The mayor has an immense platform. This mayor has used that platform to deny humanity to many people. He has used that platform to justify the killing of children. He has used that platform to refute calls for a ceasefire. He has used that platform and the policies that come with it also to send in a militarized police force into educational institutions such as Columbia and CUNY. And for a long time, the story that was told about that decision was that it was one that came at the behest of Columbia. And recently at a town hall, the mayor phrased it that he was begging them to send these officers onto campus. And I think that as Democrats, we need to be consistent that if we say that guns make elementary schools more unsafe, middle schools, high schools, why do we believe that sending them onto an institution of higher education is appropriate, especially when we saw that that decision led to a number of students being hospitalized, as well as an officer discharging their weapon, which is something that brought us closer to the violence than anything that had preceded it. And I think that what I will do as a mayor is to apply a politics of humanity, one that extends it to each and every New Yorker and each and every person that they see themselves in, as opposed to selectively deciding who deserves the right to live, to life, to safety, to justice, and who doesn't. We deserve to have a mayor who's consistent, and that's what I will be. In the context of an unrelenting genocide where the International Criminal Court had put forward a warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, and we had seen Benjamin Netanyahu come to New York City and proudly have a photo taken of him in a room in Manhattan ordering strikes on Lebanon. That is part of a larger policy that the former CIA director described as war crimes. I think that we need to see a city that is in line with its values. I think in the same manner that we honor warrants that are made otherwise. And I think there have been instances where Netanyahu has not made a trip, such as to memorials, because of fear of that warrant being honored. It's not a question solely of what will you do if that person comes. It's also making clear that that person is not welcome. When we started this campaign, there were many that treated it as an interesting idea at best, one that would be a story that would come and go. And we've surprised people at almost every turn. New Yorkers are hungry for a different approach to politics in the city. New Yorkers are hungry for a politics that doesn't require translation, that doesn't say, jump through this hoop, and then you'll find that hoop, and then over there you'll find somebody who'll take you to the next hoop. But in fact, this is a policy. You're facing a problem with your rent. You're an 82-year-old woman who comes into my office talking about how you're going to be evicted. I'm putting forward a policy that is actually going to provide you with relief.
And there you have it. Zohran Mamdani's vision for New York in his own words. This was a special episode of the Juan Manuel Benitez Wants to Know podcast. If you have thoughts on what you heard today, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, send me a message, or share this episode with someone who cares about the future of New York City. And don't forget to subscribe. In New York City, I'm Juan Manuel Benitez. Thank you for listening.